Quick note on Sunstein and moral heuristics. First and foremost, it's important to be clear on what exactly a heuristic is. We covered heuristics in week 3 when we talked about dual process theories of cognition, System 1 and System 2. This was in the happiness hypothesis text, also in our cognitive biases practice module on Blackboard. So what is a heuristic? A heuristic is a rule of thumb or a shortcut that simplifies a decision-making procedure. Examples of heuristics are especially clear in the domain of probability. So question, what are the odds of being attacked by a shark? To get an accurate answer to this question, you need to do lots of observation and careful analysis. Usually we don't have that kind of data in front of us, we haven't observed enough, or we don't have the time or ability to do a careful analysis. So we rely on a suboptimal method, but a method that's usually pretty good, a rule of thumb, a shortcut. In many cases, our beliefs about probability are the product of a shortcut called the availability heuristic, which is assessing probability on the basis of how easily you can think of an example. Now, of course, how easily you can think of an example can be manipulated. So in the case of shark attacks, if shark attacks are especially vivid and scary, and if popular culture likes to include shark attacks in movies and in TV programming, and if the media likes to give shark attacks a disproportionate amount of coverage compared to how likely they actually are to occur, you might have a tendency to overestimate the risk of shark attacks because you're basing your judgment on how easily you can think of an example, and how easily you can think of an example has been manipulated, not by the actual sort of prevalence or number of occurrences of the event, but by reporting on this event. At any rate, the point is, this is a shortcut for figuring out your answer, and is not the optimal method for figuring out your answer. Now, importantly, it's not irrational to rely on heuristics. And indeed, you can't help it. So these heuristics aren't intentional choices. People don't think to themselves, how easily can I think of an example? Quite, thus it is much probable. That's not how it goes. This kind of stuff happens below the level of your consciousness. You aren't aware that this is the kind of heuristic that underwrites your belief about various probability assessments. So importantly, these heuristics are things we use. They're ways we come to have beliefs about things because they're super useful. They give us answers that are good enough most of the time. That being said, they're not perfect, and there will be domains in which these heuristics lead us astray. We end up making errors. If we understand the heuristics that underwrite our beliefs about probability, and if we understand when they're likely to be good enough and when they're likely to be leading us into error, that would be a useful thing to know. Okay, so that's a heuristic, and specifically we just talked about the availability heuristic. There are others. What is a moral heuristic? So a moral heuristic is going to be a heuristic. It's going to be some kind of moral-ish rule of thumb that is generally good enough often enough. But there will be domains in which relying on this heuristic leads us to make errors about what is morally right or wrong. So once you have a good sense of what exactly a moral heuristic is, what are some specific examples of a moral heuristic? Sunstein suggests that the act versus omission distinction is an example of a moral heuristic, as in, it's often very difficult to figure out what the right thing to do is, but here's a heuristic that's good enough often enough. usually actions, especially let's think of this in terms of harm, actions which cause harm versus omissions which cause harm, actions that cause harm are usually worse. Such that if we use this as our rule of thumb, actions are worse than omissions, we'll do good enough often enough when it comes to getting things right, morally speaking. And he suggests that this can explain what's going on in the trolley cases. So as we have seen, and I covered this in a previous video, the trolley problem takes seriously the fact that most people intuitively think that the bridge case, pushing somebody in front of a trolley to save 5, is morally prohibited, whereas throwing the switch to divert the trolley, killing the 1 to save the 5, that's morally okay. And they take our moral intuitions about these cases seriously. They demand that our moral theories or principles be consistent with these strong moral intuitions about these cases, and try to come up with a moral theory that can account for these intuitions. And Sunstein suggests maybe this whole enterprise of taking our intuition seriously and trying to come up with moral theories that are consistent with these intuitions is a big mistake. Maybe this is a case where our intuitions are just wacky. So maybe this is a case where we're relying on moral heuristics, which are often good and lead us to the right answer, but in this case do not lead us to the right answer. Now, importantly, as we also covered in the previous video, the act versus omission, if it is a heuristic or a principle, can't explain our different reactions in these cases because they both involve acting. Throwing a switch involves acting, and pushing people in front of trolleys involves acting. So one thing that he would additionally have to spell out is how people don't see flipping the switch and turning a trolley on someone as an action. That might be the case. Maybe pushing somebody is so much more obviously an action. Or another heuristic could be physically causing harm versus not physically causing harm. So if we're specific about the kind of action in question, a physical causing harm, maybe that is usually worse, morally speaking, than other kinds of causings of harm. In that case, again, he'd have to say this heuristic, physically causing people harm, is bad. That's a good heuristic most of the time. It's usually going to get us close enough to the right answer. But there will be some cases, trolley cases, where this does not get us the right answer because it's a weird kind of case. So this is a misfiring of our moral heuristic. Okay, so if you could get super clear on what exactly a heuristic is, what exactly a moral heuristic is, what moral heuristics might be in play in the cases we've been discussing, and then what the so what of that is for thinking about normative theories, trolley problems, and what we should think about the relationship between the two, that would be great. Spell that out as clearly as possible. On top of that, we might also want to sort of analyze or evaluate this kind of framework for thinking about morality. So part 1 is just getting super clear on what Sunstein is suggesting. But now let's move on to evaluating it. So Sunstein compares moral heuristics with probability heuristics. And as he notes, it's not a perfect comparison. Now, if you go back to the practice module on heuristics and biases on Blackboard, I made kind of a big deal at the very beginning of the module of the point that cognitive biases are deviations from standards of good reasoning, and that the difference between psychology and philosophy when it comes to thinking about these kinds of heuristics and biases is that psychology is telling us what we actually are doing, how we actually think about things, and philosophy is supposed to be telling us how we should think about these things, supplying the standards against which we are judging our actual thinking as good or bad. So all of the heuristics and biases in question when we're talking about deviations from standards of good reasoning, say in the case of probability or in how we engage with and update our beliefs on the basis of evidence, whatever the case may be, there are standards of good reasoning, and our heuristics are usually close enough to meeting those standards, but since they are rules of thumb, they fail to meet those standards in certain predictable cases. Why am I harping on this now? The point is, where did you get those standards? Even in the case of probability and deductive logic and reasoning about causes, reasoning about statistical generalizations, all of those things actually are connected to important philosophical questions, but for the most part, the standards of probability or the standards of classical logic are pretty well accepted, and if our thinking deviates from standards of probability, we can say that our thinking is biased or maybe even irrational in those kinds of cases. So let's think about the Linda case. The Linda case is the case where we describe Linda as a philosophy major. Back in her youth, she was a philosophy major. She protested, major social justice type. And then you're asked to decide what's more likely. Is Linda a banker, or is she a banker and a feminist? There are other potential answers, but these are the two that matter. What's more likely, banker or banker and feminist? And most people say that it's more likely that she's a banker and a feminist than just a banker. But if you reflect on that for a few moments, this violates a law of probability, namely the conjunction rule, which says that a conjunction of two things is never more probable than one of those two things alone. So in this case, in order for Linda to be both a banker and a feminist, she has to be a banker. So the probability that she's a bank, basically, you get the idea. Okay, so we'll say that in this case, how are people arriving at their belief about the probability that Linda is a banker and a feminist? Not by following through the optimal way to arrive at a correct probability judgment. Instead, they're drawing upon stereotypes. They're using a representativeness heuristic, a rule of thumb, a shortcut, one that's usually pretty good but can lead us to make embarrassing errors like in the Linda case. Linda fits the stereotype, so we assess the probability on the basis of that and don't stop to think about obvious rules we might be violating. Now, how do we know that this is an error? If it's an error, it must fail to meet a standard of good reasoning in the domain of probability. It's an error with respect to the conjunction rule, with respect to the laws of probability. In order to call this an error, you have to say what the standard is that it's failing to meet or that it's deviating from. So now let's compare with what Sunstein is saying about trolley problems. Okay, so the trolley problem, I'm putting this in air quotes here, the trolley problem has to do with the fact that people generally believe that it's wrong to push the person in the bridge scenario, but it's okay to flip the switch in the switch scenario. And the problem is, how do we account for that? Assuming people's intuitions are onto something in these two cases, what could be the morally relevant difference? And Sunstein is going to say, there isn't one. People's intuitions are wacky in this case. We can account for them by appealing to heuristics. An error is being made. So let's examine the bridge scenario. What standard are we using? Let's say physical harm is really bad. I was going to say physically killing is super bad. That's almost always wrong. Physically killing an innocent person, that's wrong. Okay. Sorry, this is confusing. That's not what I meant right there. I meant for that to be the heuristic, not the standard. So what heuristic are we using? Okay, so maybe that's the heuristic we're using. Just as we come up with a belief about Linda on the basis of the representativeness heuristic, we come up with a belief about the wrongfulness of pushing people in front of trolleys to save other people on the basis of the heuristic that physically killing is very bad, almost always wrong. Now, there's one further, so that's one claim, that this is in fact how we end up with the beliefs that we have. That's an open scientific question. And then there is a philosophical question: is this an error? Does the belief based on this heuristic lead us into an error? If we're going to say that our belief about pushing the large person is an error, we have to say what the standard is. And we presumably something like the consequentialist standard, or save as many lives as we can, or you have to fill it in. But there is an open question here whether or not it's right to call this an error, and that question is there whether or not we agree that this case is based on a heuristic. And so a further question is, so what if our decisions about morality, if our assessments of what's morally right and wrong are based on cognitive heuristics, so what? Right? So we have assessments of probability based on probability heuristics, and for the most part, we do a good job of making probability assessments. Sometimes we're led into error. Maybe that's true with, maybe we have moral heuristics that generally do a good job, but sometimes lead us into error. We still have to say, what do you mean good job? With probability, it's super clear. There are standards of probability that most people are happy to accept. Standards of morality, those are harder to justify. That's an open question, and you need to do that in order to call this an error. And even if basically, there are a bunch of open questions where there's room for reasonable people to disagree how we should think about the heuristics that are in play, and the so what question that arises from the fact that we do use heuristics. So one last point of clarification here. A couple of people in their summaries really just focused on emotion versus reason. And so if we are making moral assessments on the basis of heuristics, it wouldn't be surprising at all if those were heavily tied with emotions. And indeed, when we put people in fMRIs or God knows what in order to figure out what's happening in their brain when they're thinking about trolley problems, this is a real thing we do. The emotional centers of their brain light up, or whatever happens when you look at fMRIs. And even then, the question is, so what? The fact that our moral assessments have an emotional component doesn't necessarily count against their being justified as moral assessments. So just because Sunstein is coming at this from the perspective of cognitive science and has something to say that is well aligned with the contemporary heuristics and biases tradition, doesn't mean that there's not room for critical analysis of not just the position he has, which I think is really interesting and something that's an important contribution to this debate, but there are these big so whats that are important to ask, even if he's generally on the right track about things, even if this is the kind of idea that we should take seriously. So it would be awesome if you end up writing about Sunstein that you give some real thought to these bigger questions instead of just being like, yep, Sunstein's right. All of our decisions about these tricky cases are just us being irrational because we are applying heuristics that are clearly misfiring. End of story. Okay, that is my short 20 minutes of comments on Sunstein and moral heuristics.